Keisha speaks out about her life with the slain rapper. I sat down with Keisha and talked to her about the Tupac Shakur.
"I'm exposing his truth," Keisha Morris once whispered to a friend, not out of bitterness, but out of quiet exhaustion. To the world, Tupac Shakur was untouchable, a poet, a revolutionary, a rapper who spoke to millions. But to her, he was a man spiraling under the weight of his fame and demons.
I married her for the wrong reasons.
What were the reasons?
I cared about her, but I married her because I was in jail, I was alone, and I didn't want to be alone.
Behind the charisma was a restlessness that no amount of love could calm. Their marriage lasted less than a year, yet the scars and silence that followed spoke volumes. The real reason Keisha Morris walked away isn't what the headlines claimed. And when you hear what truly pushed her to leave, you'll understand why some battles can't be won with loyalty alone. The day Keisha said enough. There wasn't a single dramatic scene. No slam doors, no screaming matches in the street. The moment Keisha Morris decided she was done came quietly, somewhere between the letters that stopped arriving and the phone calls that went unanswered. She was still in her 20s, trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. To outsiders, she was Tupac's wife, the woman who had stood by a man the world both adored and feared. But inside, she was just Keisha, a young woman staring down a future that suddenly didn't include the person she had risked everything for. "I felt like I wasn't needed anymore," she once admitted. Not in anger, in quiet defeat. The kind that settles in when you realize the person you love has already moved on emotionally, even if they haven't physically left. When Tupac got out of prison, things changed instantly. The world rushed to claim him. Producers, friends, lawyers, hangers-on, all demanding pieces of his attention. Keisha could feel herself fading into the background of his new life. The man who once called her every day from a cell now seemed unreachable, even when he was standing right in front of her. Her friends told her to give it time, that fame could distort priorities. But deep down, Keisha knew something else was happening. Prison had hardened him, success had accelerated him, and she was caught between those two versions of the man she married, unsure where she fit in either. So when she finally told herself enough, it wasn't about revenge. It was about something she couldn't quite name yet, a growing sense that staying would cost her more than leaving ever could. She loved Tupac. That much was never in question. But love was starting to feel like quicksand. The harder she fought to keep them together, the deeper she sank. Keisha didn't storm out or issue ultimatums. She just began to detach, emotionally first, then physically. It was the kind of quiet exit that said more than any argument ever could, and the hardest thing she'd ever done. After all, how do you walk away from a man who made the whole world listen, but never really heard you? How a college student captured Tupac's heart. When Keisha Morris met Tupac Shakur in 1994, she was 20 years old and working as a camp counselor while studying at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She wasn't chasing fame, money, or a celebrity romance. She was focused, grounded, and far removed from the chaos of the music industry. But that night at the Capitol nightclub in New York changed everything. Tupac noticed her first. He was magnetic, the kind of person who drew attention without trying. But when he approached her with his usual charm, Keisha didn't melt. She danced, talked briefly, and when he invited her to his hotel room, she looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, that's not happening." It wasn't rude, it wasn't even playing hard to get. It was simply self-respect. And that caught his attention more than anything else could have. A month later, they ran into each other again, this time at the Tunnel nightclub. Tupac remembered everything she'd said that first night, word for word. "He told me he'd been looking for me for a month," she later recalled, going to every club. For someone like Tupac, who lived fast and trusted few, Keisha's composure was completely disarming. Soon, phone calls replaced chance encounters. He gave her his pager number, a sign of real intimacy at the time, and began calling after she finished work. Conversations stretched late into the night. He opened up about his legal battles, his frustration with the system, and his sense of betrayal by those around him. Keisha listened. And for someone constantly surrounded by noise, Tupac found her silence comforting in a way nothing else was. Still, he warned her early on. "Everything I touch, I damage," he once told her. It sounded poetic then, maybe even dramatic. But Keisha didn't run from that confession. She thought love could fix what pain had broken. Within months, she was standing beside a man both idolized and hunted. And for a while, love gave them both a sense of peace they couldn't find anywhere else. They laughed. They made plans. He was funny, generous, and surprisingly tender when the cameras weren't watching. But peace was fleeting in Tupac's world. As his legal troubles escalated and his name filled headlines for all the wrong reasons, Keisha found herself drawn deeper into his orbit of uncertainty. She wasn't just dating a rapper anymore. She was standing next to a man at war with everyone, including himself. And soon that war would move behind concrete walls. The next time Keisha saw him, he wasn't in a club or a studio. He was behind bars, reaching for her through a prison visiting room window. Love behind bars. Tupac Shakur proposed to Keisha Morris before he was sentenced to prison, a decision born less from timing and more from urgency. For him, it was a way to hold on to something real while his world collapsed. For her, it was a promise she didn't yet realize would test everything she believed about commitment. They married on April 29, 1995, inside New York's Clinton Correctional Facility. The setting was far from romantic. Concrete walls, metal detectors, guards watching their every move. But Keisha wasn't chasing a fairy tale. Have you ever experienced a love so strong that you believed it could overcome anything? That's what Keisha believed. At first, it did. She visited him constantly, determined to give him a lifeline to the outside world. His thing was, he wanted a visit every day, she later recalled. It was such a dramatic process, like, oh my God, I dreaded doing it. But you know, I did it. The routine was grueling. Wake up early, drive hours, submit to searches, wait in sterile rooms, all for brief moments together, always monitored, always timed. She became his anchor, arranging visits, sending money, writing letters, keeping his name alive beyond those walls. But those same walls began closing in on her, too. She was 21, carrying the emotional weight of a man revered by millions, but isolated by his own mistakes. Her days revolved around visiting hours and phone calls that could be cut off at any second. Being Tupac's wife meant disappearing into a life defined by someone else's schedule, someone else's crisis. And yet, her loyalty never wavered. She believed his promise that things would change once he got out, that they would start fresh, build a real life together, maybe even leave all this chaos behind. But beneath those hopes were small cracks she tried to ignore. His temper, his paranoia, the constant fear of betrayal. His letters were tender but restless. One day he'd write that she was his peace. The next, he'd question who was visiting her, who she talked to, what she did when he wasn't around. It wasn't jealousy, it was fear. He once told her, "I don't want you to get damaged by being around me." It sounded noble, protective even, but Keisha sensed it was something else, a warning dressed as concern. By the time he was released, Keisha wasn't just his wife. She was his caretaker, his therapist, his emotional shield. Their marriage had become its own kind of prison, bound by devotion and guilt. And when those gates finally opened, Keisha expected freedom to heal what confinement had broken. Instead, it exposed just how far apart they'd already grown and introduced a whole new set of problems she never saw coming. When freedom became the enemy. When Tupac walked out of prison in October 1995, the world saw a comeback story. Cameras flashed, record executives circled, and headlines called it a resurrection. But for Keisha Morris, freedom marked the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. She had spent months imagining their reunion, the dinners they'd share, the conversations that would heal the distance between them, the quiet life they'd finally build together. What she got instead was chaos on steroids. In prison, Tupac's world was small and predictable. She was part of his everyday life, the person who showed up when no one else did. But outside, his life exploded. Death Row Records had entered the picture, and with it came money, power, and a dangerous new energy that Keisha had never been part of. Suddenly, her husband was surrounded by people who treated him like a commodity. Men who saw him as an investment, women who wanted his attention, an entourage that never slept. The same man who once begged for her daily visits now disappeared for days without calling. Things were getting very different once he got bail, Keisha would later admit. I felt like I wasn't needed anymore. There was no clear moment when it all fell apart. It was erosion, skipped calls, new faces, unfamiliar schedules. The Tupac who'd written her tender letters from a cell now seemed like a stranger. At 21 years old, would you have been able to handle all of that? Her quiet life no longer fit the storm he lived in. The dinner she planned went cold. The phone rang less. When they did speak, his tone was different, sharper, distracted, already halfway out the door. The love that once felt unbreakable now felt like a fading memory of someone else's life. Keisha began to notice things she'd overlooked before. The paranoia was getting worse. The trust issues. The way he looked at people like they were all potential enemies. It wasn't a good feeling, she said. Like, okay, I don't need you anymore. I'm getting out. That's it. But something else was happening too. Something Keisha couldn't put into words yet. It wasn't just that Tupac was slipping away. It was that she was disappearing. Her friends barely saw her. Her own ambitions felt distant. She was becoming a shadow in his spotlight, waiting for scraps of attention from a man who had the whole world screaming his name. And in those quiet moments alone, a terrifying question began to form. Who was she without him? And more importantly, who was she becoming by staying? I thought things were changing, that he changed, she once said. But I just felt like, wow, it was over. Friends tried to console her. They reminded her who he was, what he carried, and the pressure he was under. But Keisha wasn't angry at Tupac the rapper. She was heartbroken over Tupac the man, the one who had once promised her peace. Now, she couldn't even find peace in her own home. One night, after another unanswered call, she sat in silence and faced a truth she'd been avoiding. She couldn't save him. The man she fell in love with had become unreachable. He'd chosen a world where she couldn't follow, and beneath that heartbreak was something else starting to surface. Something she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. Something that would ultimately become the real reason she walked away. And it will blow your mind. The real reason. Keisha Morris didn't leave Tupac because of infidelity, not because of fame or money or the groupies that came with the territory. She left because she was terrified of what she was becoming. For months, she'd tried to convince herself their distance was temporary, that the man who once promised her forever would eventually slow down, come home, and remember who he was before the noise consumed him. But that moment never came. With every new headline, every studio session, every night she spent waiting for a call that didn't come, Keisha began to see the truth of what Tupac himself had warned her about. His life had become a storm, fueled by fame, violence, paranoia, and pressure that would have broken most people. Death Row Records had turned him into an empire, but one built on fear and tension. Keisha saw how people around him shifted, how loyalty blurred into control, how every move was scrutinized, every word politicized. He wasn't living anymore. He was surviving, and she was surviving with him, but barely. And sometimes, you have to be the one who recognizes you're losing yourself at the expense of another person. That was the breaking point. Not just the loneliness, not the neglect, but the realization that if she stayed, she might not recognize herself anymore. She was 21 years old, watching her own life dissolve into someone else's chaos. Her dreams of finishing college were on hold. Her friendships were strained. Her identity had become Tupac's wife and nothing more. I didn't want to be damaged, she would later admit. He didn't want me to be either. Those words carry the weight of someone who finally understood what he'd been trying to tell her all along. Tupac knew what his life did to people. He'd watched it happen to others. And somewhere beneath all the bravado and the anger and the revolutionary rhetoric, he knew it was happening to her too. Her love for Tupac was never in question. But love wasn't enough to hold back the tide of everything that came with being his wife. The lawsuits, the press, the constant fear that the next phone call would bring news that he'd been shot, arrested, or worse. At first, she thought leaving him would destroy her. Instead, it saved her life. Looking back, she didn't call it regret. She called it self-preservation. Was I hurt? Absolutely, she said. Did I feel used? Absolutely. But I understand now. Am I angry? Absolutely not. Those words carry a wisdom that only comes from surviving something that could have consumed you completely. Keisha loved Tupac enough to let him go, even when the world would never understand why. Even when it looked like she was abandoning him. Even when people whispered that she couldn't handle the pressure. She didn't just walk away from a marriage. She walked away from a legacy that could have swallowed her whole. She chose herself when no one else would have blamed her for staying. She chose a future over a fantasy, and in doing so, she made a choice Tupac himself never could, to step out of the storm before it tore her apart. Because sometimes the bravest kind of love isn't the kind that stays, it's the kind that knows when to let go. The last goodbye. Nobody saw coming. When Keisha Morris saw Tupac for the last time, it wasn't planned, it wasn't romantic, and it wasn't the reunion movies are made about, but it was haunting in ways she couldn't have predicted. He was in New York for the MTV Awards, September 1996. His name was everywhere again, on TV, in the papers, in whispers about feuds and unfinished business with Biggie. They were divorced by then. Their lives had gone separate ways. She hadn't planned to see him. But then came the message. Keisha, I'm in New York. Call me. I'm at the Hotel Nico. I want you to come down here. For a moment, she hesitated. What was there left to say? They'd already said goodbye in every way that mattered. But there was something in his voice, a weariness she hadn't heard before, something that sounded almost like loneliness. So after some internal debate, she went. When he opened the door, she barely recognized him. Something in his eyes had changed. He looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. "What's up? You look good," he said. It was casual, almost shy, like they were meeting for the first time all over again. They talked for a while, nothing deep, nothing heavy, just a conversation between two people who had once meant everything to each other, and now existed in this strange in-between space. He asked about her life. She asked about his music. They laughed a few times. It felt almost normal. Then, unexpectedly, he asked her to stay. Not in the way people might assume. No romantic rekindling, no grand declarations. He just wanted her there. "He just wanted me to lay down," Keisha said later. And he went to sleep. That's how their final night together passed. Quiet, ordinary, almost painfully human. No drama, no intensity. Just two people who had survived a war together, resting in the same room one last time. She woke early, saw him still sleeping peacefully, and slipped out without waking him. 6 days later, Tupac was shot in Las Vegas. When the news broke, Keisha froze. She thought of that hotel room, the dim light, the stillness, the way his breathing had finally sounded calm. She remembered his last words before she left. "You'll always be Mrs. Shakur." It was an echo that stayed with her long after his death. Later, she would replay that night again and again, haunted by a single detail, that she hadn't woken him before leaving. He would say, "Why didn't you wake me up before you left?" she recalled. And I was like, "You were sleeping so peacefully. I wanted you to rest." She didn't know it then, but that moment, her letting him sleep while she quietly left, was a perfect mirror of their entire story. Keisha had spent their marriage trying to give him peace he could never hold on to. And when she finally walked away for good, she did the same thing, letting him rest while she faced the world alone. It was the last quiet moment in a life defined by noise, the last time he would be still. The last time she would see him as just a man, not a legend or a martyr or a symbol. And though the world remembers him for the music, the revolution, the tragedy of his death, Keisha remembers him as he was that night in New York, silent, still, and finally, briefly, at peace. What Keisha knows now. Time has a way of revealing what matters and burning away what doesn't. For Keisha Morris, that revelation isn't about fame or tragedy. It's about understanding who she was when she loved Tupac and who she had to become to build a life after him. Decades have passed since their marriage was annulled, yet her name is still forever linked to his. When people talk about Tupac's wife, they often forget she was only 20 when the world pulled her into his orbit. They forget that she wasn't chasing a spotlight. She was trying to help someone she believed in, someone she loved. Today, she lives quietly. She's a mother, an educator, and, by choice, a private person. No tell-all books are exploiting his memory. No reality shows seeking sympathy. Just fragments, interviews where she speaks of Tupac not as a legend, but as a man. He was funny, she once said. He was emotional, generous, and human. That's the part people never saw. When she reflects on their marriage, she doesn't label it a mistake. She calls it a lesson. It was as good as it was bad, she admitted. It taught me a lot. That duality defines how she remembers him, both light and shadow, tenderness and turbulence, genius and chaos wrapped in one impossible person. Keisha doesn't shy away from the pain, but she doesn't carry bitterness either. I knew Tupac, she once said firmly. No one can take that away. I really knew him, and I'm exposing his truth now. He was a good man, and he would never hurt me. In those words lies the quiet truth of her life. She never saw herself as a victim of Tupac's chaos, but as a witness to it, someone who loved him deeply and walked away before that chaos consumed them both. She could have stayed. She could have become another name in the long list of people lost to the orbit of his fame, another casualty of the life he led. Instead, she built something different, steady, quiet, and real. And in doing so, she carried forward the part of him that wanted peace, even if he never found it himself. When people ask her about him now, she doesn't talk about the legend. She talks about the man who once said he didn't want to damage her, and in the end, kept that promise in the only way he knew how, by letting her go, by not fighting her decision, by understanding, maybe for the first time, that love sometimes means releasing someone before you destroy them. Maybe Keisha Morris didn't just leave Tupac. Maybe in walking away, she honored the best part of who he was, the part that wanted to protect her, even from himself. If you loved someone who carried both greatness and destruction in equal measure, could you walk away before it destroyed you too? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.